welcome back again to the end of the week video, where we'll review some of the questions that have arisen with respect to our study of the mystery of Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps a couple of things before attending to this week's lectures and discussion. That has to do with the writing assignment that many of you finished at the end of our section on Israel. Let me congratulate the students who did that assignment. I have heard from my teaching assistants that the quality of these essays was really extraordinarily high, and we appreciate very much the seriousness with which you took this assignment and how much you've learned. We feel very gratified that our presentation of the material has spurred such great work in the students that attempted these essays. Let me say as well that the feedback for these essays you should be receiving in the next 2 weeks. So please don't expect it immediately. There are many, many papers to go through. I hope you'll be patient with our teaching assistants, and please be assured that within a couple of weeks you will have responses to the very excellent work that you submitted. Now on to this week's material. One of the questions that came up, the main question, in fact, a very good question, very important question, maybe in some senses a question that can't be fully grasped this side of the world to come, and that's the relationship between a historical explanation of why Jesus was put to death and a theological explanation. The historical explanation is going to deal with historical factors that are singular, one-time events never to be repeated, things that happened in perhaps 30 AD with respect to the Jewish leadership and Roman leadership in the city of Jerusalem at that time, their fear about potential insurrections, worries about the popularity of Jesus and perhaps what that might mean for the security of their own position as rulers. All of these things are singular historical factors that contributed to the death of Jesus, but we'd be making a huge mistake if we limited the explanation of what happens as recounted in the Gospels to those elements. In addition to that, already in the very earliest reflections on this event within the church were added a plane of answers of a different order altogether. Theological answers, that is, Jesus dies because of the sins of the human race at large. So the question obviously is, how do we combine these two explanations? Well, before turning to that question in and of itself, it's worth perhaps reflecting on how comfortable we are elsewhere in just our normal lives with seeing events as susceptible to two parallel but not contradictory explanations. Let's think, for example, of the recent event in the United States, the very tragic shooting that took place in Charleston, South Carolina, a few weeks back by a man by the name of Dylan Roof. Now let's just imagine, this hasn't been done yet, but let's just imagine that it has been done, that he has been treated and been maybe seen by rather than treated, a psychiatrist, and some sort of diagnosis of mental illness emerges. Some people might say then that we shouldn't worry about the racial imagery that attended those slayings. Rather, what we see in this shooting in South Carolina is simply a singular random event caused by aberrant brain chemistry. I think that even though such an explanation like that might be correct at one level, it certainly wouldn't capture all that went on within the city of Charleston. For another question would have to be asked. Even if this man was mentally ill, and I should urge caution here, we don't know, we're simply, as a mental experiment, mind experiment, saying so. But let's say he turns out to be seen as mentally ill, one would want to ask the question, why did his mental illness find expression in this particular type of action? And here's where the racial history of the United States would come to play. Here, the problems of race relation obviously provided an important material cause for what happens within this city. Race relations and the problems and challenges thereof then are not, innocent here with respect to what we saw in that tragic event. These two explanations I want to suggest then don't contradict one another. They in fact go hand in hand. We had a mentally ill individual who goes into the church with a gun, but the reason he shows up in that church and desires to kill people of African American origin is because of a history of hatred between blacks and whites that tragically has marred our country's history. Both explanations, it seems to me, have to be on the table in order to accurately see what's going on here. We have a singular one-time event, but we also have, in a sense, a kind of transcendental horizon of a history of tragic race relationships that go back over 100 years. And they contribute materially to what happens in this event. I think we can see the same thing then with respect to Jesus. We can see singular, non-repeatable historical factors that led to his crucifixion. And the Gospels provide us a lot of information for how we can engage in that historical action. But the historical sources that are provided for us that give us all the information about those historical details also want to indicate to us, the reader, that there were causes that were deeper and larger than simply those singular historical factors. The fact that the disciples were involved in rejecting Jesus, the fact that one of the disciples, Judas, actually turns him over, brings the disciples into the realm of quasi-culpability. You may remember that wonderful painting by Caravaggio that was so nicely interpreted by Diane Phillips. If you go back to that painting, and you can find it on, you can Google it and find it on the internet very easily, you'll notice that Diane Phillips called our attention to a piece of fabric that joins the head of the disciple who's fleeing the garden with Judas, who's actively betraying Jesus and handing him over to the Jewish and Roman authorities. Caravaggio does that on purpose because he wants to link Judas's act of betrayal to all of the others that were there in Gethsemane with Jesus, his reputed friends. In other words, already in the Gospels, we tried to suggest, perhaps as well with the figure of Peter, all the disciples were brought to some level of culpability with respect to what happened to Jesus. And as the Gospel writers wanted us to know, these disciples represent the nucleus of the early church. Ergo, according to our Gospel writers, the persons of the church themselves are implicated by extension in this tragic deed. The very same type of thing we saw in the Joseph story, where the brothers who lower him into the pit are not simply characters in a story, but representative of the tribes of Israel. So that story both was a singular historical moment, but also meant to open up its Israelite readers to dynamics that extended over time and defined the people Israel. The same thing with the death of Jesus. We would be wrong to explain that death simply by attention to purely historical factors. That is, anxieties among Jewish leadership in Jerusalem at that time, or the Roman procurators within the city of Jerusalem at that time as well. The disciples also played a role, and by extension, they represent the church or us. So Jesus dies, as the church has always claimed, because of the sins of humanity at large. Well, thank you so much for following our class this far. We'll be entering next week into our last week of our study of the figure of Jesus as it emerges from the Gospels. We'll then turn to the subject of who is the church, But as we've already indicated, and as Professor Cavadini will indicate when we turn to that third section, we will still have a strong interest in the question of the mystery of Jesus, because that is a mystery and is a question that's never going to, this side of heaven, be fully answered. In any event, thank you so much for your excellent participation in this class, the great questions you bring to bear on all of this material. You're greatly in enhancing our experience and leading us to new discoveries as well. We wish you the very best of educational experience as you continue next week in our last week of this unit, Discerning the Mystery of Jesus within the Gospels. Thank you so much.